Jacob Whitman stood at the edge of the dock with a cup of coffee in his hand and his dog lying beside him. The lake moved slowly this morning, smooth as glass. Not a ripple except for a few curious ducks. Sunlight filtered through the trees across. The water, it was quiet, just the way he liked it. He had worked most of his life for this kind of peace. 30 years at the same company. Long hours. Big city noise. He used to dream of still water and wide skies while stuck in rush hour traffic. That dream kept him moving. It gave him a reason to save and sacrifice. And finally, one spring afternoon 5 years ago, he found this lot listed online. A modest house, a private dock, and a view that took his breath away. He closed the deal fast, didn't ask too many questions, didn't haggle. The price was fair, and the feeling was right. When he moved in that summer, the lake was quiet and the neighbors were kind. It felt like a place where time slowed down. People waved, birds sang. It felt safe. The dock became his favorite place. He added a wooden bench and a pair of chairs. He brought out his old fishing pole on Sunday mornings and sometimes just sat there for hours without casting a line, just watching the water, listening, thinking his dog Sadie made it hers too. A lazy golden retriever with a heart too soft for the city. She'd wander down the dock each morning with him and rest her chin on the wood like she was watching the sunrise on purpose. It became their little routine, their peace. So when Linda Carmichael became HOA president last fall, he didn't think much about it. He had met her once or twice at neighborhood events. She wore colorful scarves and had a voice that carried across the street even when she wasn't shouting. She smiled a lot but never really seemed to listen when others spoke. Still, Jacob figured if she wanted to spend her weekends organizing potlucks and trimming hedges, that was her business, as long as it didn't touch the lake. The first time he heard talk about new access plans, he was trimming a bush near his front steps. A couple walking past mentioned a project to make lakefront areas more welcoming for the whole neighborhood. He didn't really catch all the details, but the word shared space floated by. He frowned but let it go. Sometimes people talk big and change nothing. Then came the flyer, folded in half and left on his porch. It had cheerful language and simple sketches showing walking paths and open water zones. There was no mention of individual properties. No names, just bright colors and vague phrases about shared access and togetherness. Jacob read it twice and tossed it in the kitchen drawer. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, nothing had happened. No workers, no crews, no signs. Just quiet mornings and coffee and ducks, and Sadie stretched out beside him. Until today. As he stood on the dock sipping his coffee, he saw something that made him freeze mid-sip. A man was walking along the edge of his yard, not someone from nearby. Jacob had lived here long enough to know every face within 3 blocks. This man was a stranger. He carried a folding chair under one arm and a speaker in the other. Behind him trailed a little cart with a cooler and a rolled-up towel. Jacob watched without speaking. The man didn't seem to notice him at first. He walked like he belonged here, like he had made this trip 100 times before. Then he stepped onto the dock, Jacob's dock. Sadie stood slowly beside him, her ears perked up. She didn't bark. She just stared. The man finally looked up and gave a quick smile. "Morning," he said, like they were old friends. Jacob said nothing. The man set down his chair near the edge of the dock. He cracked open the cooler and pulled out a can. The sound of it opening was loud in the morning stillness. Jacob stepped forward slowly. "Sorry, do I know you?" he asked. The man looked up again and shrugged like it didn't matter. "Oh, I'm Darren." He said, "I'm Linda's cousin. She said it was fine to come out here." Jacob blinked. Linda said, "What? Yeah." Darren said, waving it off, "This area's open." Now she said I could hang out by the water any time. Then he sat down and leaned back, in the chair, like he'd just arrived at his own lake house. Jacob stood there with the sun warming his face and a strange cold feeling growing somewhere deep in his chest. He looked down at Sadie. She looked back at him, and neither of them moved. Jacob didn't say much after Darren introduced himself. He stood still on the dock for a long time, watching the stranger make himself comfortable. The cooler lid opened again. A second can came out. Darren popped it open and took a slow sip. He kicked off his shoes and stretched out like this was his usual weekend spot. Jacob turned and walked back toward the house. He didn't look back. Sadie followed, her steps slow and unsure, like she could tell something wasn't right. She paused once, glancing behind them, then hurried up to Jacob's side. Inside the house, Jacob set his coffee mug down and stood at the kitchen window. From here, he could still see the edge of the dock. Darren was lying back now with his feet propped up on the bench. A speaker had appeared beside him. Music played softly, nothing loud or rude, but still just enough to shift the silence of the lake. Jacob pulled out the drawer near the fridge. The flyer was still there, crumpled but readable. He smoothed it out on the counter. There it was, again in big letters. Shared use of shoreline for greater enjoyment. No details, no names, no permission asked. He let out a quiet breath and folded the paper in half. The next day, Darren was there again, this time with a folding table and a fishing rod. He gave the same cheerful wave when Jacob stepped onto the back porch. Jacob nodded once, but didn't come closer. Darren didn't try to speak again. Later that week, 2 more lawn chairs showed up. Then a small fire pit made of stones carefully stacked in a circle. Jacob watched it all happen like someone watching a storm roll in from across the lake. You know it's coming. You feel the change in the air. But you can't stop the clouds. He started asking around. Nothing direct. Just light conversations during his morning walks. A few neighbors mentioned they'd heard about the new plan to make the lake more open. No one seemed sure where the idea started. Most assumed it was discussed at the last meeting. Jacob hadn't been there. He rarely went. Nothing ever changed. Or so he thought. He decided to attend the next one. It was held on a Wednesday evening, in the small clubhouse near the entrance to the neighborhood. Rows of metal chairs lined the room. A folding table at the front held a pitcher of water and a stack of printed papers. Linda stood near the table, smiling and talking with a couple of residents. Jacob slipped into a chair in the back. He didn't want attention. He just wanted answers. Linda began the meeting with a cheerful tone. She welcomed everyone and talked about upcoming events. Then she moved on to the lake. As many of you know, we've been working to create a more welcoming lakeside experience, she said. We believe everyone should enjoy the beauty of the water. So we've begun allowing shoreline access to residents who live further from the lake. Jacob raised a hand. Linda paused slightly, then nodded toward him. He stood slowly. Can you explain what you mean by access, he asked. Of course, she said with a bright smile. Some residents live several blocks away and don't have a clear view of the water. So we're encouraging lakefront homeowners to share the space. It builds stronger ties. Jacob's face stayed calm, but his hands were in his pockets now, fingers tight. Was this voted on? He asked. Linda tilted her head like she was speaking to someone, much younger. We discussed it with a small group. It was an informal agreement. Very positive responses. Did any of those responses come from lakefront owners? Linda's smile stayed, but it didn't reach her eyes anymore. I think you're focusing on the wrong part of the message, she said. This is about everyone enjoying what we all love. Jacob sat back down without another word. The meeting moved on. When he got home that night, Darren was still there. A small lantern now hung from a pole near the dock. Jacob stood at the window again. Sadie rested her head on his foot. The moonlight reflected on the lake in soft waves. He didn't speak. He didn't yell. He just stood there in his own home, watching someone else sit in his favorite place like it belonged to anyone or everyone, and Jacob knew something was about to change. The next morning, Jacob made coffee just like always, but it didn't taste right. The dock was empty this time, but he could see signs that Darren had been there again. An empty can left near the bench, a towel hung over the railing, a single sandal forgotten. Beside the cooler, Jacob stood there for a while with his coffee going cold in his hand. Then he went back inside and pulled open the drawer again. This time he took out more than the flyer. He found the packet from when he first bought the house. It was thick with papers and old staples, but right near the top was what he was looking for, a folded map printed on thin paper with faded blue lines. His lot was clearly marked, and right at the edge was a narrow strip of land labeled Private Access to Lake Jacob. Stared at that section for a long time. Then he took a photo of it and sent it to himself. He wasn't angry yet, just sure that something wasn't adding up, so he started asking, not in a loud way, not in a pushy way, just simple questions at the right. Moments at the local bakery where he got his bagels on Saturdays, he asked the woman behind the counter if she'd heard anything new about the lake project. She said she thought it was great that people without a lake view could now walk down and enjoy it more. He nodded and smiled and paid for his bagels at the dog park. He asked another neighbor if they knew who came up with the idea. The neighbor shrugged and said he thought it came from the HOA board. They said it had something to do with making the neighborhood more friendly. Jacob asked if anyone had voted on it. The neighbor didn't think so. It just kind of started happening. That was the part that stuck with Jacob the most. It just kind of started happening. Like fog moving in slowly and quietly until you couldn't see what used to be clear. By the end of the week, Jacob had spoken to 12 people. No one really knew how the plan had begun. No one had seen any formal announcement besides the vague flyer. Some people liked the idea. Some didn't really care. A few lakefront owners were starting to wonder what it meant for them, but no one had a clear answer. And that was the thing. No one wanted to say anything too directly. It was like everyone had agreed to pretend this was normal. That it wasn't a big deal, that it would sort itself out. So Jacob went back to the clubhouse, not for a meeting this time, just to talk. He found Linda setting up folding chairs for an evening event. She looked up when he walked in and gave him that same bright smile. Jacob greeted her politely and stepped closer. "I've been asking around," he said. "A few neighbors aren't really sure how this lakeside plan started. I just want to understand it better." Linda paused with a chair in her hands, then set it down slowly. "It's really quite simple," she said. "We wanted to make the shoreline a place everyone could enjoy. There's no reason to keep it limited." Jacob nodded once, "But this part of the lake belongs to individual lots," he said calmly. "Mine, for example, it's part of the property deed." Linda's smile held, but her voice shifted slightly. "Well, we believe that the spirit of the neighborhood is more important than old lines on paper." Jacob tilted his head. "But those lines still exist," he said. She stepped past him and started setting up more chairs. "It's not something you need to worry about," she said gently. "We're just trying to do something good." Jacob didn't reply. He watched her work for a moment, then thanked her for her time and walked out on the way home. He took the long way, past 2 other lakefront homes. Both had signs of new visitors, a cooler on one lawn, a folding chair on another. And by the time he reached his front step, he knew what he was going to do next. He wasn't going to argue. He wasn't going to complain. He was going to check something that mattered more than words or meetings. He was going to open the old drawer again, and this time he would read everything. Not just what was visible, but what had always been there quietly waiting to be seen. The drawer didn't look like much. It was shallow and made of soft wood that stuck on one side when pulled too far. It had always been Jacob's drawer for things that didn't have a place, an extra flashlight, a few batteries. That one pen that still worked, but had no cap, and underneath all of it, the folder he hadn't touched since the week he moved in. He carried the folder to the table and sat down with a quiet breath. The pages inside were still crisp and sharp even after 5 years. Pulled out the original deed first. The map was printed on the back knot, the small one from the welcome packet. This was the full version. It showed every property along the lake with soft gray lines dividing each lot. His dock was clearly on his section. Dotted line, no shared label. It belonged to the lot. He kept reading. Next was a survey report with numbers and distances that didn't mean much to him at first, but as he compared them to the fence lines and the tree by the water, they all added up. The edge of the lake behind his house was not just connected to his lot, it was part of it. Not a common area. Not public land, private use included. He reached the last page in the folder and found a short paragraph that mattered more than the rest. It explained, in plain language, that the lake access adjacent to the lot was included in the title and that no shared rights were granted to others. It was signed and dated. Jacob leaned back in his chair and looked out the window toward the lake. It was quiet again. Darren hadn't come that day, but his things were still there. The chair. The cooler. The speaker half tucked under the bench. It all sat there like it had always belonged. Jacob didn't feel upset. He didn't even feel surprised anymore, just steady. He stood and took a picture of the page. Then another and another. He placed the folder gently back in the drawer and closed it slowly this time, without letting it stick. Then he picked up the phone and called a name written at the bottom of the last page. The man who had handled the paperwork when Jacob bought the house. A quiet voice answered after the second ring. They spoke for almost 20 minutes. When the call ended, Jacob felt something shift inside him. Not a sharp feeling, not a heavy one. Just a quiet sense of direction. That evening, he took Sadie for a walk around the lake. He looked at the other docks and the lawns beside them. He noticed how much had changed without anyone really noticing. A cooler here, a chair there, a trail forming in the grass where feet had started to wander. No one had done anything wrong. They had just followed something that sounded nice and easy, until the lines blurred and no one remembered where they started. The next morning, Jacob sat on the edge of his dock, just like always. Sadie curled up beside him as the light stretched across the water. He didn't bring his coffee this time. He didn't need the comfort of it. He just sat quietly and watched the ducks glide through the early stillness. Behind him was the house he had worked. For in front of him was the lake he had waited for, and underneath him was the land that was his, not borrowed, not shared his. And now he knew it for sure. The papers were clear. The map was real. And for the first time in weeks, he wasn't wondering if he was just being difficult. He was being honest. Later that day, a truck pulled into his driveway. Two men stepped out and walked toward the back with a measuring tape and some stakes. Jacob met them halfway and shook their hands. They nodded and got to work. Biabo. Fence wouldn't be tall, it wouldn't block the view. It would just mark what had always been true. And Jacob thought maybe that was enough, not to keep anyone out, but to quietly remind them where things began. The first stake went into the ground before sunrise. It made no sound except for the soft thud of wood meeting earth. Jacob stood nearby with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the workers move slowly and carefully around the edge of his yard. They didn't talk much, just nodded to each other and measured twice before every post. The fence wasn't meant to be bold. It wasn't tall or heavy. It didn't have sharp corners or high gates. It was simple dark wood with narrow gaps between each panel, just enough to see the lake through every space. There was no sign on it, no message painted across the boards, just a quiet shape forming along the edge of what had always been his. By mid-morning, a few neighbors walked past. Some slowed down, but no, one stopped. One woman waved and Jacob waved back. She didn't ask any questions and he didn't offer any answers. Darren didn't come by that day. Neither did Linda. For the first time in weeks, the dock stayed empty from morning until night. Sadie rested. Near the back porch, her eyes half closed as she listened to the soft rhythm of tools and footsteps. Jacob kept a chair near the workers but didn't hover. Every now and then they would ask him about a measurement or a tree root, and he would answer, quietly, without adding more. He didn't explain why the fence was going up. He didn't need to. The fence spoke in a way he could not. That night the frame was finished. It ran from the corner of his house down toward the lake and wrapped gently around the edge of the dock. The gate hadn't been installed yet, but the outline was clear. There was no lock on it, just a latch that clicked softly when the wind moved it. Jacob walked the full length of it just after sunset. His hand brushed across the wood. As he walked, and it felt solid, not heavy, not cold, just real. He sat on the bench at the end of the dock and looked back toward the house. For the first time, the lines felt clear again, not loud or dramatic, just honest. The next morning, there were more. People walking by, some alone, some in pairs. Most of them looked at the fence without saying a word. One man stopped and asked what it was for. Jacob smiled and said he was just marking what had already been there. The man nodded and kept walking. The gate arrived in the afternoon. It was made of the same wood, but shaped in a gentle arch. The hinges moved without a sound, and the latch clicked neatly into place. The workers stepped back and looked it over one last time. Then they packed up their tools and said goodbye. Jacob thanked them and shook their hands. When they drove away, the yard felt still again. Sadie wandered down the new path along the fence and stood by the gate. She looked back at Jacob and waited. He followed slowly and opened the latch. With a soft touch, they stepped onto the dock together. The water moved in slow ripples, like it always did. Nothing out here had changed, but everything behind him had become clear. The next day, Darren showed up again. He stopped when he saw the fence. His eyes moved along the edge and paused at the gate. Jacob was sitting at the far end of the dock with a book in his hand. He looked up once but didn't say anything. Darren didn't try to open the gate. He just stood there for a moment and then turned. Around, Jacob watched him walk away. Not with anger, just with quiet certainty. Later that evening, a neighbor came by with a cup of tea and asked Jacob if everything was all right. He smiled and said it was better than it had been in a long time. They sat, for a while, near the garden, talking about small things. The weather, the birds, the way the lake looked different each hour of the day. The fence stood behind them like it had always been there. Not blocking, just reminding. And as the sun went down, Jacob looked out at the water and felt the peace settle again. Not because he had won anything, but because he had chosen to stay steady when everything else began to drift. The neighborhood felt quieter after the gate was installed. Not silent, but different as. If something had been gently placed back where it belonged, people still walked their dogs and waved from across the street. But when they passed Jacob's yard, they didn't slow down the way they had before. The fence had settled into the landscape, like it had always been part of it. No one knocked on his door. No one asked him to explain. Even Darren didn't return. The cooler and chairs disappeared one morning, and Jacob never saw them again. No announcement. No conversation, just gone. Linda didn't say anything either. Not a visit. Not a note. Not a smile from across the road. Jacob saw her once near the entrance of the neighborhood placing flyers on the bulletin board. She looked over at him but didn't wave. He didn't either. Not because he was angry, just because he no longer had anything to ask. Everything that needed to be said had already happened. It had happened with the posts in the ground, with the gate gently swinging closed, with the quiet steps Darren took when he left without a word one. Afternoon, Jacob received an envelope in the mail, not official, just plain white with no return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper, typed neatly with his name at the top. It was a short message written with polite language. The words said that recent changes around the lake had caused concern and discussion, that certain decisions had been made too quickly, that steps would be taken to make sure homeowners were better informed in the future. There was no apology, just acknowledgement. Jacob folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the deed and the survey map. He didn't need it, but he kept it. It felt like something closing gently. The weather began to shift as summer rolled into fall. The lake grew still earlier each evening. The light stretched long across the water and left golden trails behind it. Jacob spent more time on the dock again, reading, watching the sky, letting the calm return without question. Sadie stayed close by him, sometimes resting under the bench, other times just lying at the edge of the wood with her nose facing the breeze. They didn't speak of the changes. They simply lived past them. One morning, a couple he hadn't met before paused outside the gate. They looked at the fence, at the dock, at the soft curve of the shoreline, behind it. Then they looked up and saw Jacob sitting with a cup of tea in his hand. They smiled and said, "It was a beautiful view." He smiled back and said it always had been. They asked if the lake was part of his yard. He said yes and pointed to the old oak tree where the property line ran. They nodded and thanked him. Then they kept walking. Nothing more, no challenge, no assumption, just a quiet moment of understanding. That evening, as the sun set behind the trees, Jacob stood by the gate and looked out, over the water. The breeze carried the faint scent of pine and the soft sound of birds preparing to settle. The dock creaked gently under the weight of time. The fence stood behind him without leaning, without shifting, just present, like a line that didn't divide but defined. Not because it was needed to keep people away, but because it helped remind everyone where the edges were. The neighborhood hadn't changed much, but the way it moved had. People watched more closely now, listened more carefully. There were no loud conversations or complaints, just softer footsteps and fewer assumptions. And that quiet mattered more than anything else. Jacob didn't need recognition. He didn't want attention. He had only wanted space to be what it already was. His place, his peace. And now that it was clear again, he didn't feel the need to do anything more. No follow-up, no letters, no fence extensions. The work was done, not just in wood and nails, but in the stillness that returned with it. It began with a conversation at the mailbox. A neighbor Jacob barely knew asked if the fence was difficult to build. She said her cousin had been thinking about marking their property near the woods, but didn't know where to start. Jacob smiled and said it wasn't difficult, just quiet work with clear plans. She nodded and asked if he'd done it because of the lake situation. He paused for a moment, then said he had done it because it was the right thing for his space. She nodded again and said, that made sense. 2 days later, a man from 3 streets over walked past and stopped near the edge of the gate. He didn't try to come in. He just stood with his hands in his pockets and looked toward the dock. Jacob was sitting out there with Sadie and a book in his lap. The man raised a hand in greeting. Jacob waved back. He called out that the fence looked good. Said it had a clean look that made the space feel honest. Jacob thanked him, and that was all. But that night he noticed something small. New wooden post placed in the yard. Down the street, just one. But it was the beginning of something. More people began to ask about the fence, not in a negative way. Not with resistance, just with quiet curiosity. They asked about the wood, the builder, the design. Some asked how long it took to plan. A few asked what it was like to make something visible that had always been assumed. Jacob answered when they asked, but he didn't offer stories. He didn't talk about Darren or Linda or the meetings. He talked about measurements and boundaries and how it felt to sit at the end of the dock knowing what was his. That was the part people listened to most. How it felt? Not what happened, but what it meant to feel certain again. One morning, Jacob found a hand-drawn note tucked into his mailbox. It was written in pencil and said simply, "Thank you for reminding us to look again." There was no name, just that one sentence. He kept the note in the drawer beside the folded map. It didn't need a signature to matter, Later that week, the neighborhood newsletter mentioned a new plan. This time it had more details. There would be a discussion about shoreline clarity and homeowner rights. The language was softer than before. More thoughtful, it didn't mention Jacob by name. But the meaning was clear. People were paying attention now, not to cause a stir, but to understand what they had missed. Linda stepped down from her position 2 weeks later. There was no announcement, just a quiet change in the names listed in the back of the newsletter. Jacob didn't celebrate. He didn't feel like anything had been won. It just felt like things were slowly returning to the shape they had always meant to be. The fence was no longer a topic of surprise. It had become part of the neighborhood, blended with the trees and the dock and the still water beyond. People stopped pointing it out, but they kept walking a little slower when they passed. Not to question it, but maybe to remember something for themselves. Jacob noticed small changes in other yards, not fences, but careful steps, a new marker near a garden. A bench moved closer to a porch, a pair of chairs brought back from the edge of someone else's space. Nothing loud, just thoughtful. The lake stayed the same, still and calm, reflecting back whatever stood beside it, and in that reflection Jacob saw the quiet truth of it all. Sometimes a fence does not close things in. It just clears the view, not for others, but for yourself, so you know where you stand, and so others can see that too. The lake never looked different. It moved the same way each morning, soft and slow with light that shimmered across the surface like it had nowhere else to be. Jacob sat on the bench at the end of his dock, with Sadie stretched out beside him. The air was cooler now, early signs. A fall touched the trees around the shoreline with hints of gold and red. He held his cup with both hands and watched the steam drift upward. There were no voices nearby, no sounds of footsteps or coolers rolling or folding chairs, opening, just birds. In the distance, and the quiet creak of the dock beneath him, it had been weeks since anyone stopped at the gate, and even longer since someone tried to step beyond it. The fence had become part of the landscape, no longer a topic of conversation, no longer something people studied when they passed. Now it was just there, marking a space that no longer needed defending. Jacob had not made a speech. He had not demanded anything. He had not sent letters or held meetings or raised his voice. He had simply drawn a line around what was his, not to keep people away, but to remember where things began. And over time, others had remembered too. The lake returned to what it had been when he first arrived. A quiet stretch of water that gave him back a part of himself. Each morning, a place where the noise from the world outside could not reach him. Sadie stirred beside him. She shifted her paws and rested her head near his shoe. He smiled without looking down. The sun climbed higher and the trees cast longer shadows. Over the water, he didn't have anywhere to be. There were no phone calls waiting, no projects unfinished, just the dock, the dog, and the view that had never truly left. A breeze moved across the surface of the lake, soft and cool, and with it came a small boat, gliding slowly near the far side. Jacob watched as it passed without sound, a single person inside, casting a line gently into the still water. He did not wave. He did not call out. He simply watched, and in that watching, there was understanding. Not everything needed to be shared to be appreciated. Not every space needed to be open to everyone. Some places were meant to be held gently by those who cared for them deeply, and Jacob cared. Not in a loud way, not in a proud way, but in the quiet way that comes from knowing you built something slowly and protected it without force. He remembered the early days, the first time he saw the house, the first time he stood on the dock, the first morning Sadie laid her head on the boards like she was meant to be there. He remembered all of it now with the kind of clarity that comes only after you are tested. And when he looked at the fence behind him, he didn't see a wall. He saw a moment, a turning point, where a simple line gave everything back its shape. Not just the yard, but the peace and the stillness, and the sense that he was exactly where he belonged. Later that evening, as the light began to fade, Jacob lit a small lantern by the bench. It cast a warm glow on the wood and the water. He sat there as the stars came. Out one by one, no voices, no music, no footsteps near the gate, just the soft sound of water and the quiet weight of knowing the work was done. The lake had never left him, but now the view had returned, and it was his again, fully calmly, quietly his.